Today's message text is from James, the 3rd chapter, beginning with verse 13. I invite you to stand with me as we read God's Word. If you are wise and understand God's ways, prove it by living an honorable life, doing good works with humility that comes from wisdom. But if you are bitterly jealous, and there is selfish ambition in your heart, don't cover up the truth with boasting and lying. For jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. Such things are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and evil of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first of all pure. It is also peace-loving, gentle at all times, and willing to yield to others. It's full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism and is always sincere. And those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. This is the word of the Lord.
Mom and Dad, do I have to go to school today? Yes, you have to go to school today. But I don't want to go to school. Well, sometimes you have to do things you don't want to do. School is important. But it's not any fun, it's boring. Well, there are things that are more important than how much fun they are. Brush your teeth. But why do I have to go to school? Well, so that someday you can balance your checkbook, and so you know the difference between an adjective and an adverb, and the difference between DNA and RNA. But what if I don't want to know those things? Well, someday I'm going to be old and you'll have to balance my checkbook, and I want you to be able to add and subtract. I want you to be able to get a job and a family, and your wife will want you to know how to read a cookbook, and your boss will appreciate it if your subjects and verbs agree with one another when you write. So you have to go to school. Go put your clothes on. Let's go. But I don't want to go to school. I have never had a conversation like this with my kids, but I can imagine some of you have had similar conversations with yours. The importance of education. There is a reason we demand that our children go to school, even if they don't want to. We think knowledge is important. We think intelligence is important. Of course, it's also important to recognize that intelligence comes in different shapes and forms. In 1983, Howard Gardner, a developmental psychologist, identified 9 different types of intelligence, as he named them. And he said the problem is when we try to cram all forms of intelligence into one form. He said the 9 forms are, and I quote, the naturalist, someone who is nature smart. Musical, someone who is sound smart. Logical/mathematical, someone who is number, reasoning smart. Existential, someone who is life smart. Interpersonal, someone who is people smart. Bodily kinesthetic, someone who is body smart. Linguistic, someone who is word smart. Intrapersonal, someone who is self smart. And spatial, someone who is picture smart. Of course, all people possess a number of these categories, but isn't it shocking how some people can be so brilliant in one area of their life and so, unbrilliant in other areas of their lives? I've met people who were so very good with people, but who hadn't read a book of substance in 20 years. I've met people who could work algorithms all day, but who would not speak in public if you paid them. I've met people who understand intricate relationships between Middle Eastern nations, but who don't have a clue what is happening in the chasms and creek beds and mountains of their own souls. All I'm saying is that intelligence comes in many different forms, and we send our children to school to inflame the intelligence that they have naturally and to strengthen that which might be lacking. According to Howard Gardner, there are 9 types of intelligence. According to James, there are 2 different kinds of wisdom, which is somewhat different from knowledge, if you think about it. As one of my good friends likes to say, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. Or, as one of my former teachers likes to say, knowledge likes to pull things apart in order to make sense of them. Wisdom likes to put things together in order to make sense of them. Or as Tennyson once wrote, knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers. There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Now, don't get me wrong today. I am all for knowledge. We live in a day where that's not the case with everyone. We live in a day where some people are beginning to think less and less of knowledge. I remember the Sunday in my home church before I left for college my freshman year. On my way out of church that Sunday, an older gentleman put his arm around me and offered some sort of blessing, and then he said to me, "Now, don't let them change you in college." What is education if not change and formation and developing the capacity for critical thought that allows you to think deeply about your own assumptions? We live in a day where anyone with a keyboard is suddenly an expert, suddenly knowing more than all the experts. I have seen people in the last few months, one person in particular with a bachelor's degree in political science, disagree with NASA on scientific findings. I find that ironic. I have watched people put more trust in their half hour of research on WebMD than what a doctor is telling them is in their loved one's best interests. I find that fascinating. Well, we live in a day where people sort of disrespect any notion of expertise in any given field or thorough knowledge in any given subject. I have spent most of my life in academia of one sort or another, and the last thing I want you to hear me say today is that we need less thought or intelligence or knowledge. No, we need more. But what I am trying to say today is this. I don't think our main problems today are the result of a lack of information. We have 24/7 news stations with 3 lines of scrolling data at any given moment, every second of the day, all day, every day. When something happens in another country, we know about it within 15 minutes of it happening. We know more about what's happening in other countries than people a century ago knew was happening in the community next door to them. As you've heard before, there is more power in one of our cell phones in our pockets than in all the computers that put the first man on the moon. It's staggering. We know so much today. In fact, you could say we know more. We know more information than any civilization that has ever graced the planet. But the question for us today becomes, even if we know more, do we know better? And this is where James speaks into our time. James says there are 2 kinds of wisdom, one from below and one from above, and you can distinguish between the 2 largely by the kinds of lives they produce. If you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition and arrogance in your hearts, then your wisdom is earthly and natural and demonic, he says. This is the sort of wisdom that sets people against each other, that sees education as a zero-sum game, in which if you know more and more and more about a thing, I must be knowing less and less and less. Education is seen as a competition, and our brains are sort of weaponized against each other. This type of wisdom destroys communities, James says. It gives rise to pride, not humility. The more one learns, the more one's brain swells. It's puffed up and condescending. A few years ago, I was pastoring a small church in country Texas And an old man in that church saddled up to me one Sunday and he said, "You know, it takes preachers 3 years to get through seminary, and it takes them the rest of their lives to get out." You've seen it. I've seen it. You put in a room a group of people where everybody knows it all, and sooner or later there will be a fight on your hands. This wisdom is from below, James says. It is earthly and it is of no use. But there is also a wisdom from above. Did you notice what he said in verse 13? "Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show it by his good behavior and his deeds of gentleness and wisdom." This isn't what I expect James to say here. This isn't how I usually think about wisdom. I think about wisdom usually in rational categories. I expect James to say something like, "Is any of you wise? Then parse this verb, solve this equation, pass this test." But that's not what he says. James says that wisdom, true wisdom, impacts one's behavior. It impacts one's life, not just one's IQ. And did you notice verse 17? Wisdom from above is pure and peaceable and gentle and reasonable and full of mercy and good fruit and unwavering, and it's without hypocrisy. I might sound crazy, maybe I am crazy, but this list of descriptors here sounds like an echo of what Paul says about love in 1 Corinthians 13. Did you hear how similar those two are? Do you remember what Paul says about love in 1 Corinthians 13? Love is patient and kind. It doesn't envy. It doesn't boast. It isn't arrogant. It doesn't act unbecomingly. It doesn't seek its own. It's not easily angered. The way Paul talks about love and the way James talks about wisdom are eerily similar. You see, knowledge impacts just how you think. Wisdom impacts how you live the fullness of your life. And different forms of wisdom result in different ways of living. Wisdom from below tears a community apart. Wisdom from above builds a community up. Wisdom from below is threatened by diversity. Wisdom from above builds community based on diversity. Wisdom from below makes one prideful. Wisdom from above makes one humble. Wisdom from below often wars against love. Wisdom from above is synonymous with love. Wisdom from below empowers evil. Wisdom from above empowers goodness and righteousness. Wisdom from below seeks to tear things apart in order to make sense of them. Wisdom from above seeks to put things together in order to make sense of them. Wisdom from below makes one proud of all they know. Wisdom from above makes one humble because they recognize all that they don't know. Wisdom from below sets brain against brain. Wisdom from above sets brain beside brain. Wisdom from below seeks to win arguments. Wisdom from above seeks to make peace, which is where James ends his argument about wisdom. The seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Last night, like many of you, I was watching the television, seeing appalling images coming from Charlottesville. It hit me. You know, we've been talking about race in this country for decades, centuries even. We've been thinking about it. We've been studying it. Sometimes it's been under a microscope, literally. There's been study after study, paper after paper, book after book. We have talked and talked and talked about race. The truth is, we've talked it to death here at Second Baptist Church too. This last summer, we had a Wednesday night series devoted to it. We talked about a number of things. We talked about education disparities and how differences in education follow children their whole lives through. And how if our schools are neighborhood schools and our neighborhoods are segregated, our schools are segregated too, as segregated as they've ever been. We talked about redlining. Have you ever heard of redlining? If you've never heard of redlining, you should Google redlining. You can be an expert in 30 minutes on redlining. If a white person bought a house in one part of town and a black person bought the exact same house in a different part of town, because of redlining and the legal practice of real estate agents, the white person's house, through no effort of their own, would increase in value. And the black person's house, through no fault of their own, would decrease in value simply because of the red line districts. And how for most people, their house, their home is their primary investment. And this is happening and nobody's doing anything. It's sort of racism without racists, and yet it's happening. And then you multiply that generation by generation by generation by generation. We talked about the criminal justice system. Do you know there are more black folks in prison today than were enslaved in 1850? Can I say that one more time? There are more black folks in prison today than were enslaved in 1850. And did you know all the ramifications that happen in a person's life because of cyclical poverty? Even health care, there are vast health care discrepancies when it comes to cyclical poverty and even middle class folks. We've talked about all these things here at Second Baptist. I'm kind of tired of talking about it. Yesterday I was watching those images and it hit me that the problem isn't that we don't know. Our problem today is not a lack of information. It's not that the data isn't there. Our problem isn't that we don't know. Our problem is that by and large, we don't care. We don't care about things that don't impact us or someone whose name we know. The problem is not so much a part of our brain as it is a part of our will. And until we simply care, until we care enough to make peace, until we care enough to be honest about our own history, until we care enough to repent, until we care enough to humble ourselves, and at least be open to the idea that black folks might know more about racism than white folks do, then we will get nowhere, brothers and sisters. The opposite of love, y'all, is not hate. The opposite of love is death. And to borrow a phrase from Martin Luther King Jr., if we don't learn to live our lives together, then we will die apart. Just like Lady Wisdom in Proverbs 8, that choice is before us today. Wisdom leads to peace. And by peace, I do not mean quietism. I do not mean just not shaking things up. And I don't mean just being quiet. I mean the Jewish idea of shalom, which is wholeness and connectedness. It means realizing that your joy and my joy and all of their joy out there, your kids' opportunities and my kids' opportunities and those kids' opportunities, your pain and my pain and their pain, your work and my work and their work are all intertwined and part of one fabric of reality. Shalom is about harmony between us and God and us and all God made and us and our neighbors and us and our enemies. And wisdom is that which sees the big picture and the connectedness of these things. People who can see that are wise, no matter their IQ or their ACT score. And people who cannot see that are foolish, no matter their IQ or their ACT score. Wise people, no matter what they're studying, Do so in a humble posture before God and an open posture before their neighbor. Foolish people, no matter what they're studying, do so with a prideful posture before God, a God who looks a lot like them, and a closed posture towards their neighbor. This is why knowledge in and of itself will never save the world, brothers and sisters. You can teach a bigot how to calculate a formula or read a short story or interpret history, but they'll likely graduate as a more informed bigot. We send our kids to school to learn more about the world, whether they want to go or not. We send our kids to church, whether they want to go or not, I assume, to learn more about themselves, to learn more about the world that lives in them, and the God who is their beginning and their end and their companion every step of the journey. What good is it, brothers and sisters, if our children can explain everything about the world and lose their own souls? What good is it, brothers and sisters, if our children can recognize a right angle but cannot recognize right, or do not have any gumption to stand for it? What good is it, brothers and sisters, if our children know what is going on around the world but are strangers to the world that lives inside of them? What good is it for our children to learn about the civil rights movement of the 60s if we are not teaching them how to engage in that very same work today? The church is the academy of love. The church is the school of the interior life. The church is the university that teaches us about our shared life together. There is one world and one reality. There is no other sort of life than common life together. In a minute, I'm going to invite Kathy forward to lead us in prayer as we start back to school. As students, we want to pray over you today. As teachers, administrators, we want to pray over you today. But I wanted to share with you my prayer as we head to our stations. And I want to share this with you today because I think it would be James' prayer for us today. I pray that as your knowledge of the world increases, so does the expanse of your heart. Have limited certainty and unlimited compassion in a world where most people have unlimited certainty and very limited compassion. I pray that as your wisdom grows, so will your humility. After all, as has been said, the greater the island of knowledge, the longer the shoreline of wonder. I pray that as you study the world, you will also know who you are, and that is one who is loved by Christ. Nothing you can do more, nothing you can do less can ever change any of that. I pray that you will learn to radically love your neighbor and recognize your need for your neighbor, because none of us are as smart as all of us. I pray that you will have a holy curiosity about all the things God created. I pray that you will strive to make peace, shalom, with everything you encounter, and strive for justice and fairness and goodness and harmony. I pray that you will value the perspectives of others, but seek God's will first and foremost. We send you all out to learn and to grow. All you students, even if you're 95. We send you out to learn and to grow. To open your mind to all of God's knowledge. But even more so, today, to open your hearts to all of God's wisdom. And all God's people said,